new software for me, and so I think you heard me talking at the beginning, but you weren't able to see my screen. So just to give you a little bit of background if you're just joining, I want to go ahead and let you know that we're excited to share a lot of these best practices within the UX research space and within UX as a whole. And it's a 30-minute session, but I want you to go ahead and enter questions and any kind of comments that you have during the process, and at the end we'll take the time to answer those live. And if we run a few minutes after the 12:30 mark, then if you need to jump off, we completely understand. So getting right into it, we realize that decision making is really a process of logic and emotion. And a lot of what people are thinking and feeling, like if you're buying a car, like right now I'm buying a car, there's a lot of logical aspects that go into that, which are how big is the car, what is the gas mileage, you know, a lot of utility-based things. But in the end, a lot of the decision-making is gut-based and really based on that side, which is a little bit hard to identify. So as researchers, the crux of what we do as qualitative researchers is we use a combination of methods and usually go for open-ended or semi-open-ended, non-leading methodologies. So we're trying to get into the areas of what the customers are thinking about, but they're not able to articulate. And in this, we use ethnography as a basis. We use field research as a basis. And today we're going to talk about grounded theory methods that we use as a baseline for a lot of the work that we do. So today's world is completely overwhelming, and we've got messaging coming in from different channels, and we have SMS and Slack and chat, and I had actually I turned off my notifications because sometimes notifications are coming in from all different angles and it's just too much to keep up with. So because of this, there's a huge amount of competition for time and attention. So because of that, new perspectives are needed, and that's where we come in as UX researchers and UX designers, is that we're looking at it from the product side. How are people really using products and services? And how can we use UX research to dive into that in more depth so that we can understand the real needs and behaviors? And that's why UX has really come up in organizations and has become a strong strategic piece in decision making for a lot of initiatives moving forward, because now the product is the central piece of companies, and we need to really focus then on that and not just traditional marketing methods. So if we look at complexity, this is sort of a 10-year cycle here. The quantity and the complexity of information is rising exponentially, and it's really hard to keep up with that. And this is what we've learned, is that underlying behavior of people is sort of flatlining. The ability for people to actually deal with that complexity of information that we just talked about before is kind of at a standstill, and there's this point that we as UXers are sort of governing. We're taking a look at this and trying to map the difference between the speed and the acceleration of how fast technology and opportunities are moving, and that includes gestures and IoT and all kinds of things that are happening, yet people aren't quite moving as quickly as we would like. So this is another sort of angle to look at, another perspective, where in a static market, in a stable market, you can use traditional market research to predict change and trends. And even for 2 years in, you can take a look at that market and run surveys and gather data and use big data in ways to slice and dice it and see what's happening. But in the real world, it's changing too quickly because of the dynamics of the marketplace and the fickleness of the consumer and the constant changing needs. We have to approach this in a different way, and we call this cultural probing, where we use different research methods to dive deeper into specific areas where we look at, okay, I think there's water here and I want to probe in this area. Oh, there's no water. I'm going to move and I'm going to probe into this area. And this really reveals true needs, problem areas, unmet needs, things that are happening in the real world and gives us opportunities to really innovate into these areas. Tricia Wong is an ethnographer, and this quote was really perfect for what we're talking about right here, where people get caught up in the quantity side of the equation. They're looking at big data, for example, and they're not really focusing on the quality of the business insights that analytics can bring. So more numbers do not necessarily produce more insights. So moving into the type of research that we do, this might be familiar to you, big data, online surveys, and focus groups. We're really concentrating on how people live, which is the top half of this, one-on-one interviews, field studies, and moving into ethnography. And instead of looking at what people think they might do, we want to understand how people really live. And the best way for me to think about that is if you take a poll, and if I was speaking to you in person, I was looking out at the audience, and I asked people, how many of you wash your hands when you leave the bathroom? Raise your hands. Oh, all of you. Well, that's awesome. That is a focus group. That is, what people think that they might do. They feel a little bit of peer pressure to raise their hand. They don't want to be embarrassed. So you get a pretty good reading, but it's not accurate. And if you put a camera in a bathroom, I think that there was a study that showed that 4 out of 5 people wash their hands, but not everybody. So it allows us to think about this from a current state and future state, where we want to look at what's happening now, and we can report on that and make assumptions about that. And I'm always going to be a huge fan of data, no matter where it's coming from, because we want to look at information. So big data is, and any kind of quantitative research is really exciting, but we want to see a little bit deeper into the what and understand the why, and that gets us into the one-on-one interviews, the field studies, and the ethnography. So the problem is that ethnography by nature takes a long time. And what we have been trying to do as an organization is streamline that process while still maintaining the rigor and the value of the work that we do. And that's really what we're trying to show you and share with you today, is how can we do that. So you might be in a current state where you're a company and you know that you need to keep moving and changing your product to meet the needs, the ongoing needs of customers. Maybe you have a beta launch or a soft launch, or you're moving into a more complicated market, and you're trying to figure out, what do I need to change or simplify, or what do I need to add feature-wise to the current product? Well, that's really the current state, and this type of research works well for that. But if you're just doing usability testing, then you don't need to go through the rigorous process that we're about to unveil, because you can use standard usability testing and quick feedback cycles and use the models that are already in place to get information about your current state and where you need to move. If we want to quote, and I'm quoting with my fingers, innovate, because innovation sort of leads to this whole sexy thing, like we're going to really innovate in this amazing way, when a lot of times what we want to do is create tangible, usable, utility-based, functional things that can actually be integrated into people's lives. So that's really, really important, that we think about what we're trying to do in the future as being something that is relevant to people and can actually be something that they're going to use. So enter hypothesis-driven cycles. So it is based on an assumption, and a lot of what we're going to be showing you today is that you need to focus, and you need to look not broadly but very deep into a core audience to understand these things. But it allows businesses to make decisions in 6 weeks rather than 6 months. So, for example, a lot of companies that we work with are starting these divisions, and they're not R&D divisions. R&D maybe looks 2 to 5 years out, and it's kind of established in certain industries. But what we're looking at is maybe innovation teams, or EIRs, which are entrepreneurs in residence, and people that are taking the time to look at the market, look at what they have from a product standpoint or a branding standpoint, and think, okay, this is where we want to move. And they have a lot of hypotheses about where they can take the business and what type of new initiatives they want to launch. So we have a couple clients that are EIRs and some new groups that are looking into business areas, and they have a lot of data. They've done a lot of legwork they've met as groups, and they've mapped their business needs and the business priorities to what they think are end user needs, and that's a really great place for us to start. So the hypothesis really allows us to do quick research, but deep research, and rigorous coding and taking a look at the data to understand it. And the results kind of are varied, but they can get into jobs to be done results. They can get into mental models or behavioral segments. We do a lot of that. And you can then, after 5 to 6 weeks, decide what type of deliverables you want to get out of that. If you want to formalize the deliverables into journey maps, and if you want to create behavioral personas and hand them out to the team, that's something that will take a little bit longer than the cycle will produce. But all of the elements that we go through help create those types of deliverables. So in the end, we have an assumption, and then we allow these short cycles to explore these concepts or these theories. And then if we need to, we can pivot, and we can move into another group or a new area, and that question has been answered. And if we feel like we've got our question answered in the right way, we can go deeper the next side. So a lot of people say we don't have time for this. And Ellen Isaacs, who's a park ethnographer, said that she believes that if people had invested, or companies had invested, a handful of weeks into rapid ethnography, which this is based on, they would have saved themselves years of misdirected work. So I think it's really important to understand that, yes, this takes some time, but it's going to answer questions in a way where it allows people to move forward. So what does the approach look like? Well, this is going to build and show you sort of over the weeks what happens, but you have to focus. And really, as you get into the different pieces, you need to understand who your audience is specifically that you're reaching out to, and what are the characteristics of that group. And you may be outsourcing for recruiting, but we do a lot of it in-house. For the reasons are mostly is that we want to put the rigor into finding the right people, and it takes a lot of handwork to find the right people that we want to talk to. If it's a current audience and you have reach into that, you could also do intercept recruiting off of websites or through existing marketing channels, but we do suggest that you put enough time up front into understanding how to hone in on answering that question. So the inquiry piece, we typically do remote interviews because it does shave a lot of time off. But if we have a little bit of extra time, we like to throw in a few one-on-ones or contextual work, because we're also gathering images and data about their lives and some videos so that we can tell stories later. The rapid analysis I'll get into in a bit, but in the end, the output is very informal. It's affinity diagramming and having whiteboard sessions. And mostly, as we get into the planning stage for cycle 2, we've typically done legwork up front and brought a lot of data back to teams, and then had active working sessions to go through the data, touch it, you know, find out what we think are the valuable and important pieces. And those work sessions allow us to determine next steps and also answer that question, should we pivot, should we dive deeper? So this is based on grounded theory methodology, and it was founded in 1967 originally when Margaret Mead did a great job with anthropology, but a lot of researchers, especially in the academic space, felt like there wasn't enough rigor to this type of research. It was non-systematic. So grounded theory sort of came about as a process of rapid analysis, lots of iterations. And to be honest, in the grounded theory methodology, they start out with no hypothesis, but they do want to ask questions that help funnel and focus the answers that they're getting. So a lot of what goes into grounded theory is a coding process. It categorizes and it describes, and they call it open coding. And so it's something that we're going to get to in a little bit more detail. So something that was new to me a couple years ago, I mean, it wasn't new. I sort of understood this in the back of my head, but Allison Meyer, who is a colleague of ours, had a brown bag in our office, and she came in and her first slide said, analysis and synthesis. Mostly we use those terms in one sentence. She said, but did you know that the two are opposites? And I think we just looked at each other in a group and we went, whoa. Because analysis is about deconstructing and breaking down the information, whereas synthesis is about reconstructing and putting it back together. And there was a live chat in a group that I'm in that has to do with UX strategy and research and design. And they said, you know, if you were teaching UX researchers something and you wanted to give them really tangible information, what would you say? And I just think this is so important because people get out of school and they think, oh, interviewing is not that hard. And ethnography is actually not that hard. I just have to go to where the people are and sit and listen. And that is great, and it is true in some ways, but really the rigor around the analysis and the synthesis piece is where we as a team have put our focus and why it's way, way different than guerrilla testing or ad hoc testing. We talk to a lot of teams also that have ethnographers in-house, and they do a lot of contextual visits or in-home visits or in-office visits, and they're gathering a lot of data and insights. But in the end, their notes, called memoing basically in grounded theory methodology, come back as anecdotes. And those anecdotes are helpful and relevant and very important. If any of you listening are those in-house ethnographers or researchers, it's very important that you bring that back. But by going through this process, we're actually taking anecdotal information and putting it into a more grounded, rigorous process where we can stand back and look at the data and feel very strongly that this is something that we want to communicate across the board. So, big aha moment for some of you. Analysis and synthesis are opposites. So another thing that we thought, okay, if we're sharing this information, what do we think is helpful for teams? So this is an example of sample hours or key tasks for different pieces of the process per participant. So if we look at kind of this hard, I had easy, medium, and hard, and really all the projects that we do are hard because if they were easy, people wouldn't come to us. And so the recruiting is hard. We're reaching out to difficult to find people, C-levels within Fortune 500 companies. You know, we have our methods, but basically it's time, and it's being innovative in the way that we reach out to people and use different lists and use our own database. But it does take about 4 hours per person. When we get into inquiry, it seems like it's 1 hour, but actually it's more like 2 hours because you have to set up, you have to consolidate notes and download video. Debriefing is something that we feel is really important, and we've added to our process. And so a debrief or an interpretation session is something that we do after each interview, be it remote or even a contextual interview. We sit in cars and just talk it through. You always need 2 people. So our methodology has 2 people. We have note takers, but those note takers are part of the debrief process because we can write things down and take notes, but we want to understand what did they mean when they said that? What are we actually getting to that become insights or takeaways? And what are we going to end up coding as we go through the analysis and the synthesis process? So you can see that for a 12-person study, just the key tasks, and this doesn't include project management or meetings, it doesn't include, you know, like rigorous output. It's 240 hours. And that gives you a sense when you have multiple people on it, how you might need to staff up internally and think about this in terms of time and dedication. And we also need to have, during this process, a dedicated team. It's very much like agile or lean methodology where you have to have that level of focus with 2 practitioners at least during that time frame to really make this work. So another thing we thought was helpful to look at is how to actually frame the research question. Again, in grounded theory, you don't start with a hypothesis, you start with a question. And really, if you take the hypothesis of the EIR, that entrepreneur that has this concept around a new business venture that they want to do, we want to frame that in a way where we're not asking the what. The what can be done with surveys, it can be done with big data, you can look at what's happening. We want to get into the how or the why. And in this case, we want to look at, okay, here is potentially an opportunity for new players with available power and resources. What are the attributes to come into the market and address these and then unmet product needs? So we want to frame this so that we can answer and get deeper and deeper into the process with the how or the why behind it. So another thing that we felt like was really interesting is how we look at sample size and how do we convince stakeholders that this information is valid. And that is something I'm sure you've dealt with if you've done usability testing or any kind of qualitative research is, oh, how do we know that we've talked to enough people? Well, the truth is that there are no rules for sample sizes in qualitative work. It really depends on what you want to know, what the purpose is, the background and the characteristics of the audience that you're talking to, and really what can be done within time and resources. But we have chosen 12, and we have come to this through years and years and years of doing so many different levels of projects. But I think that this visual says it all, is that you can do research with less volume, because the more volume, the more participants you need, but then you get just so much data that you can't actually get through it. So by slicing this into a format where we're asking a specific question and we are talking to a specific audience, we are able to get to what we call descriptive saturation, which is shown here, which is when the researcher gathers data to the point when nothing new is being added. And as researchers, we kind of have a sense of that. If I make the team go out and do 18, or I say, okay, well, we're going to do 24 just to make sure, at some level, usually 18 to 20, we realize that we're hearing the same information. We're not getting new information. So this chart shows that in a project, you could have, if you have 1 to 6 people, you're going to get 80 different codes, basically. And we'll talk about codes in a minute. And as we get into 7 to 12, we get maybe 20 more codes. But as we get 13 and on to 60, we're only getting a little bit of new information as we raise the sample size. And that was just an aha moment for our team, where we realized that there was some justification to the 12 people that we actually want to get. Open coding, as we get into the data, is actually a form of categorizing the chunks of data that we get from the interviews. So we divide these into transcripts, and then we divide them into coded pieces of data, and we cut them out and stick them on the wall. And yes, we use Excel, but we find that there's a lot of value in touching each piece of information by hand and creating these categories. So we hear what they're saying, and we put them up and say, well, what do they actually mean? What is it that they're trying to say, and why is that important? And as you move up, we call this kind of a bottom-up approach. We end up with these actual statements of categories, which end up becoming themes. And that's really how we move forward with this. But I will say that you can speed up the process by putting multiple people onto the project. And you need to have some knowledgeable moderator, we call that person a slave driver, who pushes the coding process through. And we call this the Effner method, after Troy, who's right there, or effing. So basically, try and do this, but make sure that you have someone that can help push the team through all the way to the end, because you will want to stop. Another thing that we did when we're working with clients and we're actually on site is we do take walking breaks to talk through the data. And we find that by going outside and getting a breath of fresh air, we are able to actually step back in and continue to go through the process. Another thing that has been really helpful is to use these big giant poster boards, the Gator boards or the foam core, where we can actually put it. You can see one against the wall over there, and we're looking at a lot of wall space that's necessary. So getting into the coding itself, you move from text to code to subcategories, and then you get your themes. And this is just an example from a research project that we are doing with fitness tracking. And we have sort of the open-ended text that we're asking first, and then we probe and clarify and understand a little bit closer to what they're actually meaning when they say that. And then we get into the code or the category or the theme, which in this case is versatility. And I will mention that the data that we're using to do that level of coding is actually from a diary study. And we do tend to use different methods of collecting data. And if you do a diary study, it's going to be a separate webinar and discussion, but that can be done concurrently after the interview and sort of roll in, and it might add a couple weeks to the process. but you can also gain a lot of additional insights and detailed information in context, and so it's exciting. So getting into coding details, and we have something else that we've been able to do with the data that's been very successful, which is creating a spectrum of information, or what we call spectra, that we use to develop behavioral personas. We put these pictures on the wall, we look at it, you're constantly referencing and constantly comparing, and that's another piece of grounded theory that's so important, is that you're looking at data, comparing the data, developing the chunks and doing the affinity diagramming to understand what are the behaviors and the attitudes, and what are people really looking at and doing and feeling and thinking, what are their needs, and how do we chunk that up in a way that makes sense. And these again lead to those sort of mental models and journey maps. So to wrap up, what are we doing with all this data? And we tend to move into journey maps. This is an example, a generic example. And journey maps typically that Indy has really put out there, Indy Young, looks at what the business goals are and the business understanding and those assumptions that are made, and really maps that against what the end user or the target audience is looking at. What this is a compiled version after we've done 12 interviews, and we look at what is their mental model, and sometimes it does lead into a journey map. It doesn't always lead into a journey map. And I think we've been careful in the past 6 months to not promise journey maps all the time, because sometimes the patterns end up being a little bit more behaviorally driven or contextually driven, and they're not always a linear path. So we hope that we're able to share in this 30 minutes a lot of the things that we feel have been important for our team and really help push us to another level of thinking and rigor. And I guess I want to leave you with this thought that in the end, sometimes you may have assumptions about how a product is used, but it may be used in ways that you would really never imagine. So thank you so much for your time. And that was quick. I talked fast. I want to sort of leave you with a takeaway. We are going to be doing these ongoing, so please join our mailing list. And I did want to make these 1-hour consultations available. If you feel like this information is helpful and you want to talk about it more specifically with what's happening within your organization, or maybe some assumptions or questions that you have, then feel free to reach out to me directly, and my email is right there, kelly@gotoresearch.com, and I'd be happy to have a call and talk to you about what's going on with your team and answer specific questions. And we've been doing a lot of workshops and driving through this process and doing real research, but helping teams sort of learn during the process. When you download these, there's also going to be an appendix that's available, and so we'll put references to everything that we talk about here and make sure that, again, you have these slides and a lot of the information available. So thank you so much. So if you have to jump off, we're at the 12:30 mark, but I am going to look at the questions now and see. I see Loot Crate is there. Hi, Coburn. And Justin's there. Hey, Justin and your team. I'm not necessarily seeing a ton of questions, but let's see. Loot Crate team standing by. Okay. Uh-oh. People are not able to see my screen. Yep, so sorry. Well, this is where I would unmute you guys and have you talk to me, but let me see. Okay. People are saying, how does the debrief phase help expedite the analysis and move into open coding? Okay. Well, Justin, good idea. Basically, when we are adding in interpretation sessions during longer studies, and the shorter studies we call debrief sessions, sometimes they can take as long as the actual research itself, but you have to have two people coming into it and talking through that process. And the way that it expedites the process is that we're actually doing some of that upfront analysis, pulling out the insights and the things that we feel most important live, and you can actually report on that, and that can be a simple deliverable kind of out of each phase of research. So you can summarize that at the end of the day and send it live to any stakeholders or team members that are part of that process, or you can consolidate the debrief or interpretation information as a simple report. before you get into the details of transcription or coding. So let me know if that answers your question. I'm happy to chat about it in more detail. Jen wants to know if we're posting the slides. Yes, we are posting on the Goto Research site. There will be a new area called education, and we'll be posting the slides. And we're also we're creating rapid research, rapid UX research videos, and those are 80% complete. So we hope to have those out in the spring, and those will be for purchase, but these webinars will be free, and I really hope you share this information around. Dinsima says thank you, and you're welcome. And oh, so researchers that are working solo, that's really interesting. You know, for researchers that are working solo, I think that one of the most important things is to see if you can do pair researching. So bring a product person with you. There's so many product people that feel that they don't get out and touch and talk to the audience enough and understand how people are using the product, and they don't have the opportunities to get out. And so if you're able to pair with another researcher, a product person or even another UX designer during this process, they will learn so much. And during the debrief sessions, you can start to hone in on what are the important things that we heard. What did they say when they said that? How can we, and sometimes we sketch things out together, but it really is this collaborative aspect that does speed up the research and the findings and makes the process whole. So for solo researchers, I really recommend that you try and pair up. Tina says, great job. Thank you so much, Tina. A lot of this is inspired by you and your team and the thinking that we've done together. So if you have a diverse population, Melanie is asking, is 12 still okay? And the answer is yes and no. Basically, we have learned that you need to focus. And so when you say diverse, we would need to get into a little bit more detail of what diverse means. But we have tried to do at least 6 in each of 2 potential categories. So I would say that you might be able to do 2 different groups and 2 segments within that 12 people. But the results that you're going to get aren't going to be as easily coded and compiled. So you really need to focus. And we've gone back and forth with this as an organization, also with clients that want to reach out further. And we have found that in this particular rigorous method that you need to do at least 8 people. And 12 gives you enough that you can stand behind it. But you need to be as focused as you can for that point. Coburn says, have a question. Do you ever squish the 6-week time frame into a shorter period of time? Well, people want things the next day, and some people have a 3-week turn. And I would say that within the 3 weeks, and we have done 3-week turns, we have not been able to be this rigorous with the coding process. So what we're doing is we are setting up a project so that the product team can gain insights from the research itself and participate in the interpretation sessions. And yes, we would have a high-level report, but it's really, really tight. And so you can do a week of setting up the project, making sure that you have your hypothesis sort of down, your question asked, and then you can look at the recruiting specifications and start the recruiting that same week. We're actually doing a project right now that's a 3-week turn, and it's a specific audience and it's a specific product that we're looking at. So definitely you can get the bulk of this done in 3 weeks, but really when you need to do the rigorous analysis and then you have to have a workshop session, that's where the 5 weeks comes in. So yeah, we can ramp up pretty quickly, but in the end you basically get raw data and we move into a workshop at that point. Justin wants to know if we're defining some of the codes at the early stage. Yes. So that is where a lot of the coding process actually starts. And again, it's a lot of detail in terms of dividing up, but there's a couple of ways of looking at the numbers and the insights that we gather in an hour. And a lot of the sessions we do are 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So we do get a lot of data that we code. And so we try as hard as we can not to make assumptions over the themes, but if you're just doing affinity diagramming on the fly and you're looking at processing through insights that you've gathered, you can start to come up with hypothetical themes, but the truth of the rigor behind the research is that you let the themes emerge naturally. So you might be able to come up with hypothetical themes and saying, here's some of the things that we're hearing, and here's some of the things that we feel people are saying that are insights, but these are anecdotal. And the truth is that once we go through the rigor of the bottom-up approach, the Effner method, then you start to see these themes emerge through the data. And that is the basis of the process that we go through, is that the findings are in the data itself. And we can assume things and we can hear things as practitioners, but those are our assumptions about it, and it's actually not the data itself. So Dmitry wants to know, how do you select people for interviews? Do you find people from different places with different background, or just some people from the office are fine? Well, that depends on who your audience is. So when you have anyone that's shopping at Amazon, or maybe people that are looking for specific kitschy, techie gadgets, you might have to go to different places of finding those people. But if you have kind of an everyday audience, sure, you can get people from the office. If you're doing usability testing, you can get people from the office. But this approach, you need to hone in specifically on who you have questions about, who can answer your questions in the best way. So usually those people are specific. We have kind of a lengthy process. As much as we try and be quick, we have processes behind everything we do. So our screener actually is pretty lengthy, and we tend to, one of the reasons why we put so much time into the recruiting process is because we screen very generally at the beginning for people that might fit very general categories that we're looking for. And then we use the phone to go through naturally by asking some semi-open-ended questions and let them answer, so that we get through liars and we are talking to the right people. So there's a process there that I think we have on our list to talk about in one of these virtual seminars. Leora says, thank you. Do you use design thinking for analysis? Absolutely. So design thinking, actually, the term is a little bit loose, in that now design thinking is a saving grace for a lot of companies that want to move into the UX space, and they basically take design thinking workshops and they learn how to cluster and do analysis, and then they take lunch and leave. So design thinking itself as a concept is great for an organization, but the process itself is, if we're doing this type of method, it's very, very rigorous. And I think that a lot of companies don't understand how design thinking actually works. So when we go, and I'm not sure I can understand the question, but can you tell how to divide? Oh, I see, divide the information by criteria. So that's another question. And we can talk about design thinking in another session, but it could be the workshop itself. So the workshops that we do are in-depth. They have a lot of process involved. We sometimes prototype live. We come up with solutions and work in groups to not only move stickies around, but create concepts. And then those concepts sometimes turn into prototypes, and you kind of go on and on to the design process itself. And so we shortcut it as much as we can, but we get as much participatory design in the process. And Justin wants to know about what the thoughts are on client involvement. Well, it depends on who the client is, and if they're researchers and they're knowledgeable and they're partnerable, like Tina's team, and basically it's about who the client is and how much they know. We do not want to spend our time and the client's money educating them. So if they're going to be part of the process, then we ask them to be part of the holistic process, and they can participate just in the debrief sessions, but if they want to do a workshop, it is hands-on, 2 days, focused effort, and if the team wants to be part of that, then they have to be part of that as a whole. We did have a client recently in New York where they put everything on a wall, and they were able to get a lot of people to participate in the process by walking by, and those people had to participate for an hour at least at a time. But it was tricky for them to get their heads into it, to be honest, and you needed to have a core team that really held it from beginning to end, as well as that slave driver, Troy, who really pushes through that whole process. And we also did have remote people. We had computers with webcams that were faced to the data, and so people can participate remotely, but it is a process that needs to be sort of dealt with on a really detailed level. Sandra says thank you. Yeah, I know. Melanie says it was an aha moment about analysis and synthesis. Can you believe that, it's not something that we were, at least I was not holistically aware of. So I think there's actually a lot more questions, but I think we're kind of out of time. I'm going to look through a few more. How to interview for a product that's unlike others. Okay, we'll have to talk in a little bit more detail, Jen, about those. Mechanical Turk, there's a lot of mechanical, sort of automated services for surveys and other things, and definitely we utilize data gathering as much as we can. We tend to, however, go through our tried and true systems. So I'm going to leave it with that. Thank you guys so much for staying on and bearing with me as I got my tech sort of sorted out at the beginning, but I really hope that this was helpful. I welcome feedback, and again, happy to set up calls to discuss this in a little bit more detail if you have additional questions. And yeah, sign up and join the next web seminar and go ahead and share this with your team. And I'm going to end the recording. Thank you so much.